so she's asked me to present her slides on her behalf. And if we would just introduce Gavin as well, who will also be presenting, and then we'll go on to the housekeeping and the agenda. Gavin, do you mind introducing yourself?
Sure, yeah, hi. Morning, everyone. So for those who don't know me, I'm Gavin Lockhart. I'm the clinical lead for children and young people's mental health across the South East with NHS England and also with Health Education England, and I'm a day a week at the University of Sussex.
Great, thank you, Gavin. And Anna Maria, do you mind just showing the timetable for this morning, and then we'll do the housekeeping. So really, we want this session to be interactive. I'm going to do a short presentation. It might take a little bit less than 20 minutes. We'll be a bit flexible because what we want to generate is conversation with you around how we take this agenda forward. So after that, Gavin will be doing his presentation, and that bit I think will be particularly interesting, looking at the clinical practice and guidance around good practice around children that we care for, edge of care, adopted children. And then we want to have plenty of time for talking about what we might do as a system in this area. We've got some reflective questions that we're going to pose at the end of it that we're hoping would generate the conversation. And then we will finish at 12 o'clock. And the general housekeeping, which I think you're all quite familiar with, is stay on mute. And because there's quite a lot of us, if you can introduce yourself, as Rachel said, when it comes to the discussion, and also please use the chat box for any questions, anything that comes along, and we'll try and answer those. So, shall we head straight into the presentation? And there may be questions that you'd have that I won't be able to answer because I'm not Andrea. But what we will do, if there's any questions, we will take them away and then get back to you, and we'll do it that way around. But I think quite a lot of the stuff in these slides you'll probably be familiar with, and you will have seen some of it before, hopefully. So could we have the first one, Anna Maria? Thanks. So this first slide really just sort of sets out the headlines of how this has come about, and I think you've all been involved with this. So it's really started with lived experience from children from whom we're corporate parents. And of course, you know, we have a duty, all of us as corporate parents, whether we are providers or commissioners or managers in any services, as far as the Children's Act is concerned. We had experiences, and actually I was involved with some of the beginnings of this, where we had looked after children placed outside the local authority who just simply could not get access to mental health services. And that was a great deal of concern, really high risk situations. And then we started talking across the Southeast, and actually what we saw quite regular pattern of this particular cohort really struggling to access mental health services that met their needs. What Andrea then did, really very helpfully, took it on board and started talking to the children's directors, lead members, all the CCG providers, designated leads, and children and young people. And they did a big piece of analysis. And as you can see, the cost is 2.4 million per week for local authorities. We're talking big money here and big issues. Sorry, I just got Deborah popping up on my screen there. Andrea then also took it to CESLIPS and the leaders for adult social care and a Freud support NICE committee to have a dialogue around how could we start thinking about standards and guidance. And I think one of the key points Andrew was keen that I made at this point is that the vision has been changed to ambition because of the demand and the pressures. So what we're really wanting today is thinking about what ambitions do we have for this cohort, rather than this is what you absolutely must do, but how do we take this agenda forward, because it's so important. Could we go on to the next slide, really? I'll talk a bit more later about the different phases. So I think the reflective questions we will ask later on in the session. So if we just leave those for later, Anne-Marie, we can come back to those. So just in terms of data, I'm sure in all your local plans that you will all have data around looked after children edge of care. And I think what we can see is that the numbers have been going up, and the pandemic has been particularly affecting this cohort. And our social care colleagues are telling us that the referral numbers are going up and children are going into care. Is a great concern, really. And I think a little bit of context around money and the sort of kind of money that gets spent in other systems that we don't always get to hear about. 2.3 million per week is the average cost. So, this cohort pings around in the system quite often and has cost not just the local authority, obviously, but also police and health and third sector, where there's also quite a lot of engagement. Do you mind going on to the next slide, please? And again, here you can just see the rate of looked after children going up. And I think one of the things that Gavin was particularly quite keen that we also brought into the conversation is edge of care and the adopted children in this conversation. And I know from the local area I come from, the edge of care is as great an issue as for children who are being looked after. And actually, we probably shouldn't really differentiate between those two labels. They're actually the ones that edge of care, for those that don't know, are children and young people, predominantly young people who are sort of within weeks really risking going into becoming looked after if there's not significant input through social care and through health. Next slide, please. And again, unaccompanied asylum seekers often don't really hit our agenda. And actually, out of the cohort of looked after children, they are probably the most complex children that we're seeing in our system because of their experience they've had prior to coming into England. And I think what Andrea particularly wanted me to show is that some areas have not that many unaccompanied asylum seekers, but for Portsmouth and Kent in particular, these are really key issues. And I'm sure you will have seen stuff in the news as well, how those systems are struggling to cope with the demand. And so I think we want to thread that conversation into the overall picture as well. Next slide, please. And again, just going back to the phases, so I think you will all have been part of phase one, which was about putting the pledge together that all ICSs have now signed up to, all local authorities have all signed up to. And that pledge is around that we will plan and we will think about how we look after the needs of looked after children in all our services. There's a bit about tariff in there as well. So for those of you that deal with sort of the money side of things, there were issues particularly around some areas overcharging by 3 or 4 times the normal rate. So there has now been an agreement about a sort of standard tariff charge around looked after children who are placed out of county. Now, I know that that is not quite happening at the moment, but that may well be reinstated again in the future. And I'll show you a little bit later where you can find that, but it sets out all the roles and responsibilities and who's accountable for what. And then the second segment in the slide there is what we're doing now. It's some of the outputs that we've agreed after phase one. So that's about starting to have some community of practice developments. The NICE committees has embedded recommendations. These are being rolled out nationally, which is really very encouraging. And as Gavin is going to talk about in a minute, he's produced an evidence-based guide, which is really welcome because I think we have stuff in different places, and actually what this guide does is brings it all together in a really one-stop shop for both commissioners and managers in social care. And then phase two, as Andrea has put it, is for the brave and the bold. And I think what we want to use the opportunity today to think about how do we become the brave and the bold? What can we do to make some of these changes? There is a mature systems conversation that's taking place in part of the system, and that is really talking around how does the health system, in this case particularly the mental health system, start working with our social care colleagues in a more integrated way. There's also some funding coming through Department of Education, which I hope the information's go out to all of you. If it hasn't, then that's something that we can forward to you. Next slide, please. And on this IFE's clinical network is where you can find all the guidance, and that's where all the recorded videos will be as well. So if there's anything that you missed in some of the other sessions, they will be available there. Next slide, please. So again, as I said earlier, the clinical guide has been complete, and it draws on an evidence-based practice, the most up-to-date, has expert consensus, has input from children and young people who've been receiving care. So often the materials that we've been working with previously is very clinical, but this is also has gone out to young people in care, and we got feedback. It collects some key informations and recommendations and best practice and practical tips and tools and resources. And I think all of you should have had a copy of this. If you haven't, then we can send that out after this session as well. And we'll obviously also send all the slides out. Next slide, please. And so another sort of key thing that Andrew was really keen that I brought out to you was that we do have CEO sponsors around this piece of work. And the sort of conversation is about ensuring how the community mental health transformation, the 0 to 25 young adults transformation, is enabling the design of care levers therapeutic offer. And we're also obviously thinking how the mental health framework going forward, we'll be thinking about care levers so that we know that at the moment they're not served well, but they are a distinct cohort who have quite significant mental health problems. And when we talk about prevention, that's a really good place to start to thinking about how that transitioning takes place. And again, West Sussex, Kent and Portsmouth are piloting co-permission mature conversation with social care providers. And one of the kind of key areas for those who have worked in social care and have anything to do with commissioning placements for these children and young people, what's often difficult is that sort of therapeutic and mental health offer in those placements and how that gets commissioned and delivered consistently, and how mental health services wrap around these children who are placed in different places in the country. And there are some quite significant challenges around that. Next slide, please. So the preventative lens, I think what Andrew has put these numbers up is really around the rate of child protection plans. And what we can see again, the numbers are going up. And I think she hasn't put it on this, but I think children in need numbers are also probably significantly increasing. And what our social care colleagues have been telling us is that their system is under some pressure as well. Next slide, please. So systems enablers, and again, what we want to be thinking about for this cohort is prevention. So if you take the long view and all age perspective, what can we do for these children and young people that actually stops them from having to go into adult mental health service, or at least have better outcomes into adulthood? Because at the moment, they are probably the most vulnerable cohort who have quite poor outcomes in adulthood and really struggle to access services. So in Kent and Portsmouth, there's some really strong preventative strategies. They have a whole systems approach, which is really worth looking at. Of course, we've got the mental health support teams and the potential use of the voluntary sector to use more effective where we have workforce gaps, and there will be a session later on in July where we'll be sharing best practice around how you can use the third sector in bridging that gap for these young people specifically. And then the causal analysis and responsive design, system design is not just for children, it's all age, and it's recognizing the importance of children become adults. And actually, you know, if we can focus some of our early interventions for this cohort, then the idea obviously is that you should see less distressed adults going into the system. And really what we're looking is whole system ownership of that preventative agenda around children's mental health, both increased investment and community mental health transformation. So those of you might be familiar with Think Family, has been around for a very long time. So it's that you don't just think about the adult in isolation who might be receiving a mental health service, but actually a lot of those adults who are receiving adult mental health services also have children. So how do we think about whole families? And equally for the children and young people, how do we think of them as whole families? And the family safeguarding model that quite a lot of you will be familiar with in your local areas is really around what we know. One of the sort of markers for being more vulnerable is where an adult in the family has got either alcohol, substance abuse, or mental health problems. And what's classically talked about is the trio, the toxic trio of alcohol, drug abuse, mental illness, and domestic violence as the sort of key indicators where we need to pay special attention. Next slide, please. And here there's a couple of links to ACEs, trauma-informed and ACEs research, and I think you all know what ACEs stands for. And if you need more information about that, obviously we can send that out. But I think the conversation for this cohort is really changing to start thinking about trauma and formulation of needs and how we best support them. And again, the Lancet publication is I'd really recommend that you link in with these two if you're less familiar with this topic area. Next slide, please. Great, thank you, Anne-Marie. And this slide really is around how difficult it is for this cohort to access services. So, and this is why a trauma-informed approach is really important. So often systems kind of require you to reach out if you want help, but for this particular cohort, there are extra barriers in place because of their previous experience of not having much faith in the system, having feel let down, having difficulty with relationships and trust. And so the sort of DNA protocols that we see in some services really doesn't suit this cohort at all well. And I think some of the thinking that we'd like to generate is how could we make services more accessible to this cohort that actually meets their needs, make it flexible. And I think the last point about individualizing support offer for 0 to 25 and community transformation partners in each ICS. So Andrea has put her name forward to be a link where you want to work specifically around this cohort for your adult mental health transformation services if you feel you need more support to develop those in this with this particular cohort in mind. Next slide, please. So that's kind of come to the end of it. Any questions at this point?
There's also an opportunity to ask some questions after Gavin's slot.
Yeah.
So if people wanted to hold on. Don't see any hands up so far.
I think let's move on so we can have discussion at the end of it, and then probably questions will be raised at that point.
Okay. Gavin, are you okay to start?
So, hi everyone. I think for those of you that were here at the start, so I've already introduced myself. So I'm Gavin Lockhart. I'm the clinical lead for children and young people's mental health across the south of England, with NHS England and Health Education England. Just a little bit in terms of my background, which sets a bit of context for this piece of work. So right from when I did my core training, which I scarily worked out the other day was 20 years ago, which makes me feel quite old. I've always been interested and quite passionate about children in the care system or on the edge of the care system and how we support their emotional mental health needs. Chantal won't thank me for this, but I know Chantal Homan's on the call, so I did a specialist placement with the service that she was in when I was training. And then after I qualified, I worked in mainstream specialist camps for a while, but then after a couple of years moved across into a couple of subsequent specialist teams that were set up to work with children in care, but also children on the edge of care and children post-adoption. So some of those young people who the traditional setup of services really wasn't meeting their needs. And they were both multi-agency needs. And actually, that's where Rachel and I first came across each other, with Rachel's role as the manager of the secure children's home there. And within those roles, then started to specialise more in attachment-based therapies alongside some of the mainstream therapies that I'd trained in. And it was also quite key in the development of one of the services, which was the 0 to 12 multi-agency service. So I have some of that kind of service development background in the mix as well. And then in more recent times, I've also done some additional training. So I'm a CBT accredited therapist alongside being a clinical psychologist, but I've also done some recent training in interpersonal therapy, which has quite a strong attachment slant within the approach there to supporting young people with low mood. So if we can go on to the next slide, please, Anna Maria. So just in terms of the next 20 or so minutes, going to just give you an overview of what the Clinical Review and Practice Guide is and a bit of the context of why we developed it, why we were asked to develop it, and how it matured along the way. I'm going to just talk through the contents, because I think it's quite useful just to know what's actually in there and how that might be used. I'm going to just introduce you to some core overarching principles that are in the guide, that we start the guide off with these core overarching principles that I think actually apply to all of us when we're thinking about mental health and emotional wellbeing needs of children and young people in care. And then there's just a few slides picking out some of the key messages from the document. Obviously, we can't summarise the whole document in a 20-minute presentation, so I definitely recommend having a look at the document if you haven't already, but we'll just try to pull out some key messages, and I've particularly tried to highlight some that are perhaps most pertinent to the commissioning and planning of services and delivery of services. And then it's not on this slide, but we've added in a couple of case examples at the end just to illustrate some of the key points from the guide. And then, as Lila said, we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So do feel free to add questions in the chat bar as we go along, and we'll try to address those when we get to the Q&A section. Can we go on to the next slide, Anna Maria, please? Thank you. Super. So you will have seen this slide already in Lila's presentation. So that was a bit of a spoiler alert. So just in terms of context, so early on in COVID, myself and a colleague pulled together a paper to support restoration and recovery planning. So it wasn't an academically rigorous paper, but it was just an attempt to bring together some of the evidence base out there, some of the literature out there to help services in thinking about their restoration and recovery plans. And on the back of that, Andrea then took me to one side and said, hey, Gavin, do you think that you could maybe do a 1 or 2 page summary of the evidence base around children in care and their mental health and emotional wellbeing needs? And the aim of that document was to really be for independent reviewing officers and social workers to an extent as well, in terms of how they can think about, ask questions about, and start to plan support for mental health and emotional wellbeing of children in care. So I said, yeah, that's fine. Andrea uses the word mature. So it matured along the way from being a 2-page document to the form it's currently in, because I think what we quickly discovered as we started to pull it together is if it was really going to be useful in practice and usable in practice, it needed a bit more detail in there. It needed more practical tips and guidance in there, as well as just giving information about evidence and research. So it evolved into the form it's in. And again, as it was evolving and maturing, I think what we came to realize is actually this document could be really useful, not just to IROs and social workers, but to the wider children and young people's workforce. So we have been explicit in the document that the document wasn't intended to inform service planning or say how service planning should go for this cohort of young people. However, there are probably bits in there that are going to be really useful to be considering. The other thing that has happened along the way is we published the document, and then within a few weeks the draft NICE guidelines came out. So I don't know if any of you have seen those, but they're currently on the NICE website. So they're updating the guidelines around children in care. So we have cross-referenced this document with the draft guidelines, and there is a huge amount of consistency in there. There's a couple of extra bits in the NICE guidelines that aren't in our document, which is around supporting relationships with birth families and siblings. So I think that's probably an important angle for us to be thinking about. And there's also one extra bit that I've added into the slides to just highlight that came out of the NICE guidelines. But actually, beyond those, it was incredibly consistent between the two, which is really encouraging. So I think there's a couple of other things I just want to say before we get into a bit more of the meat on the bones of the document. So first off is I don't think there's anything in the document that's new. So what we've done is we've tried to collate all of the reports and guidelines and research that's out there around children and young people in care just into one document, as Lila said. So hopefully there's nothing in there that's new. There's an extensive reference list at the end that gives people an indication of where we've drawn our information from, but we also spent a lot of time consulting with experts in the field, and our acknowledgement list just reflects some of the experts that we spoke to along the way and shared ideas with and versions of this along the way. So it's very much been a co-produced effort. So the focus of the document is on recognising, understanding, planning and providing support for the mental health and emotional needs, wellbeing needs of our children and young people in care. As Lila said, the document is focused on children in care, but I think probably what we all know is that many children that are on the edge of care or adopted will have very similar needs. The needs are going to be very similar, and I think sometimes we can be at danger of planning services around children in care and forget that the two on the edge of care and post-adoption, where these kind of services might also be incredibly helpful. So the document draws on evidence-based practice. Again, Lila already said this, and I think our definition and our approach to evidence-based practice is really following the three-legged stool idea. So sometimes when we're talking about evidence-based practice, that can be very much reduced to what's the research evidence. So we were really keen that it wasn't just about research evidence. It includes expert consensus, which includes the views of young people, care leavers, caregivers, and also preferences, wishes and characteristic of this group of young people. So I think that's important context when we go on to some of the headlines from the document. And as I said already, and I've alluded to this, so the document does provide some really key information for people that might not otherwise have access to that or know it. It does provide some recommendations, but also it's got a very practical flavour to it. So there's some real clear tips and tools and resources in there as well, particularly for non-mental health professionals. So if we can go on to the next slide, please, Anna-Marie. Fantastic. Right, so this is the table of contents. What we've done in the document is created hyperlinks so that you can zip around the document quickly, because we appreciate people are often busy and it's quite a long document to try and work through in its entirety. So I've already mentioned that we've got the core overarching principles to start with. The first section of the document then is around beginning to identify and explore mental health and emotional wellbeing needs with children and young people in care and the system around them. This section is largely aimed at non-mental health professionals, and so there's a lot of content in there about demystifying some of this, maybe offering some assurances and some tips about how they might approach this. And it also provides some suggestions of key areas to be asking about or covering, key questions that you might ask, and key tools or resources that you might ask to gather that information. We've stuck very much with tools and resources that are freely available, just so that's applicable to a universal audience. So that's our first section of the document. The second section is then moving on to planning support. And the first subsection within that is really around wellbeing and resilience. And I think what came through from a lot of the things that we were reading, researching, was that this is so central. This is so central, even if we've got young people who are quite affected by how difficult that wellbeing and resilience input can still be really critical. And it's also input that can be very well delivered by people who aren't mental health specialists. So we're at pains to emphasize that. So that section outlines some headlines in terms of the type of support around wellbeing and resilience that have an evidence base behind them and who might be able to deliver those. So it's really trying to a call to arms, I suppose, for the wider system around things that they could be doing, even if a young person's quite significantly mentally unwell, emotionally unwell. The second subsection then talks about healthy attachments. And one of the things that we've tried to do in these next two subsections is pick out when might this type of support be useful. So rather than starting from a position of assuming that it's going to be needed for all young people in care, how would you know? How would you pick that out? And then what does the evidence base say about types of support that work best and are the most effective? So there's a section on healthy attachments, similar section then on mental health difficulties, which is a bit longer and explores a little bit around diagnosis and medication and psychological formulation as well. Has a table in there around different types of mental health difficulties and what the evidence base is in terms of what can work really well for those. There are also some tips in there about referring in specialist mental health services as well, just to demystify some of that process. So if we can go on to the next slide, that'd be great. Thanks, Anna-Marie. So the core overarching principles for those of you that haven't seen the document already. So that mental health and emotional well-being of children and young people in care is everyone's responsibility. We've all got a role to play. There's something that we can all do that could be of value and help here. This principle of doing with, not doing to, and really emphasising there that actually for this particular group of young people, they're perhaps even more disenfranchised than other young people in terms of having some agency and choice in the things that happen for them. So we've really emphasised that, and we've picked out needing to be particularly attentive to that in young people in care who might have an experience of being done to, and where they haven't really had much choice. For those of you that are familiar with dyadic developmental psychotherapy, this principle will be very similar, but this idea of acceptance, curiosity and empathy, and that peppers any kind of interactions or conversations, whether that be with the child themselves or the young person themselves or the caregivers or actually colleagues in other agency. It's just a principle in terms of our interactions around these kind of conversations and this kind of planning. We've emphasised inclusion, so starting off really very much from a position of non-othering. We absolutely need to be mindful and attentive to some of the unique needs that children in care might have, but we want to start off from a point of non-othering and inclusion and reasonable adjustments, rather than starting from the assumption that they need something completely different. Looking beyond behaviour, I think, does what it says on tin, but it's really saying, you know, behaviour is an end product. It's a manifestation of something else that's going on for the young person. So let's just think about what that is that's underlying the behaviour. The no one size, I won't talk to each of these, but the no one size fits all. One of the things that we're really keen to emphasise is actually when you look across any types of difficulties that a young person in care might have, it's very rare that there's only one approach that has an evidence base behind it. So we were at pains to emphasise that from the get-go, that there isn't a one-size-fits-all, that often there might be a choice of maybe 2 or 3 different types of approach that could be really effective for a given difficulty. And I think Rachel had already emphasised that last point really around just how powerful and significant and central building supportive adults around the child or young person is, above and beyond anything else that we do. And the last point just in blue at the bottom was really largely targeted at IROs and social workers, because this was originally developed to support the annual review process. So we wanted to just emphasize actually that these needs are ongoing, they can change. So we just need to be constantly monitoring and responding to these needs and being flexible and fluid in our approach. Okay, so can we go on to the next slide, please? Thanks, Anna Maria. So key messages. Right, I think that this is probably an older version of the slide. So what I will do, if it's okay, is just share from this end. Is that all right, Anna Maria? Super. Hopefully this will work. There we go. So I've just highlighted a couple of bits in red here that I thought might be particularly useful when we're thinking about commissioning and planning services. So I've already hinted at this. So wider holistic understanding of a child or young person's life is really critical to understanding and also supporting their mental health needs. So health, well-being and resilience is at the core, but it can be so easy for us to overlook that or downplay that. But the evidence and papers we were reviewing suggested it's often the most engaging for young people in care and acceptable for them, but also the most successful often. And that can negate the need for specialist input, or it can complement the benefits of and sustainability of any specialist input. So I think in terms of service commissioning and planning, one of the messages there would be that this should absolutely be considered as part of that mental health and emotional wellbeing offer. We've already said this, so I don't think we need to reiterate that too much, but we know that a significant proportion of effective support comes from the adults already in the young person's life. There is an incredibly strong evidence base for consultation, and I think there's a real need for some rebranding and fresh perspectives on consultation, that it isn't a fob off. I think sometimes it might be viewed as that or experienced as that, but actually the evidence base is that that's really strong, which makes sense. Because if we're thinking about these young people and where some of their difficulties come from, often it's from traumas or disruptions in the relationships in their life. So if we can support the people who have the ongoing regular relationships with them in their life, that's going to be far more impactful often than them having maybe individual therapy. I think there's a question, though, that raises in terms of care leavers and adult mental health services and the way that they're set up. So often, child and adolescent mental health services might be better set up to offer consultation to the system around the individual. So I think that presents a question just in terms of commissioning for care leavers and adult mental health. The other bit I just wanted to highlight here, so this is something new in the recent guideline update, the draft guideline update, which is a suggestion that there should be an outreach offer to children in care while they're awaiting CAMHS input. And they're quite clear that that shouldn't be just delivering what they would have gotten once they get to the top of the wait list, but I think is perhaps alluding more to this consultation type offer. So I think, again, that's an important point for us to think about if we're thinking about commissioning and planning services. Although it's really well intentioned, not all young people in care need therapy as a result of their past or present experiences, and that can often be a desire or a well-intentioned drive. However, the flip side of that coin is that being in care does not mean that young people aren't experiencing a specific mental health difficulty or a specific neurodevelopmental difficulty that would benefit from a very specific assessment and diagnosis for some, and for which there's some evidence-based therapies and treatments. So they shouldn't be denied that being considered and access to those kind of assessments and supports and treatment. While we're pulling the document together, we're giving a lot of thought to complexity. So sometimes it feels like complexity can act as a barrier for young people in care being an example, accessing certain types of support. And so one of our key messages is that the presence of complex or multiple needs doesn't mean that evidence-based approaches for specific elements of their presentation will be ineffective. And I think with that needs to be a really clear message, because that's often an assumption that's made. However, those evidence-based approaches might need to be part of a wider package of support. So I think maybe rather than thinking about complex interventions, What we need to be thinking about is multi-component packages of support, and we might need to think about the pacing and the sequencing in those, and we might need to consider adaptations or augmentations for the specific young person and their circumstances. However, we would do that for any young person, so I don't think this is new or unique. Next key message, so attachment focused support and support for specific mental health difficulties. They're not either or. They're not mutually exclusive. And again, sometimes I think there can be a risk that we go down that path when we're thinking about children in care and we're planning for children in care. So I think the key message there, just in terms of service commissioning and planning, is that both attachment focused support and support for specific mental health difficulties should be part of the offer for children in care. We know that attachment focused support can improve mental health, but that might not negate the need for specific mental health intervention. So a really good example here is post-traumatic stress disorder. So we know that a significant proportion of young people in care will be experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder or complex PTSD. And it's out there explicit trauma and the trauma memories, that it's highly unlikely that those symptoms and those symptoms the young person is experiencing are going to improve. And on the flip side, we know that mental health interventions that include caregivers, which they absolutely should as much as possible, whether that's for a child in care or not, can improve carer sensitivity. We know that it can strengthen placement security for children in care, but that might not negate the need for specific attachment focused interventions. And the guide just unpicks that a little bit more. I think an underlying message throughout is that there is really important to have that psychological understanding or formulation of the young person's strengths, difficulties and needs. Just put this in because I think sometimes this can be important to know. It can sometimes be a bit controversial. So although it's really well intentioned, when you look at the evidence base around, so this is specifically around attachment focused interventions here, the evidence base for individual therapy, which includes creative therapies, is of uncertain value. So you need to be really explicit there. It's not saying they're ineffective, but it's just saying that the evidence is not clear, is quite mixed, isn't compelling. What there is really strong evidence for is parenting programs, video feedback programs, or dyadic interventions, which might include things like dyadic developmental psychotherapy or theraplay to develop that carer sensitivity and behaviour management. And what the guidance and reports that we reviewed were also saying is that those kind of interventions might still be possible in residential settings if we can identify maybe a couple of key figures within those residential settings who can work with that young person, but they might need to be adapted to that professional carer role. However, it's recognised that those kind of interventions might not be possible for other young people in care. So, for example, unaccompanied asylum seekers or care leavers. But again, the reports and publications that we reviewed, guidelines that we reviewed were highlighting that there are other interventions that can be effective for those young people in helping them to develop emotion regulation skills, in helping them to develop interpersonal skills and strengthen their approach to relationships and attachments. So examples might be things like cognitive analytic therapy, dialectical behaviour therapy, interpersonal therapy, trauma-focused CBT for complex trauma. Just a note on diagnosis, so there can be an absolutely understandable fear of locating the problem in the young person, or there might often be, we often hear this kind of narrative of, well, their presentation's really understandable and normal, given the background that they've had. And it may well be, but that could really risk us underdiagnosing or under-recognising mental health or neurodevelopmental issues. And we know that diagnosis in children in care, just the same as it is for children who aren't in care, can be helpful for some and less helpful for others. And often it's the approach to the diagnosis that makes the difference. And it's really important that it occurs in the context of a psychological formulation. Medication, again, there's quite clear messages throughout everything that we read, which was saying that it should be offered in the same way as it would be offered to children who are not in care. So back to that idea of non-othering. So hopefully all of these things gives just some ideas that will that will stick around in terms of service commissioning and service planning for children in care. So just wanted to end on a couple of case examples to illustrate some of these points. So the first one, so this actually came from a low intensity psychological interventions training program. So in my previous role, worked at the University of Sussex, delivering a program that was a children's wellbeing practitioner style program. We had someone put forward from the program who worked in a children in care service. And there were some really mixed views from the service around whether that was going to be suitable or useful training for them to undertake because of the complexity of children in care. However, she came on the training. She worked with children in their service throughout the training, and she saw this one young person who was a primary age primary age girl in foster care. Had a background of parenting, which included drug use and all the kind of experiences that we might expect to come with drug use, with paraphernalia around, people coming in and out of the house and things. So she was in foster care. She was referred to this practitioner, this trainee practitioner, with a phobia of needles. And so we did quite a careful assessment. We supported the trainee to do quite a careful assessment to just unpick, is there any trauma in here, given her background? And we were assured that there wasn't any signs of things like PTSD. And this needle phobia was presenting a really major issue for her because she needed dental treatment because of her background. She hadn't had good dental care over the years, and she wasn't able to have that because she had this needle phobia. So the trainee did a piece of graded exposure, quite straightforward behavioural intervention, including the caregivers, 8 sessions. Managed to link in the social worker with this to a degree as well, and the dentist, which was fantastic. And the young person overcame their needle phobia in those 8 sessions. And there were a lot of skeptics in the service at the beginning of the piece of work about whether this was appropriate or going to be effective. Incredibly effective. So she overcame the needle phobia. She was able to have the dental treatment that she needed. The dentist gave feedback that her dental health now was in a really good position to set her up for the rest of her life in terms of her dental health. But not only that, but it had a ripple effect. So the caregivers were reporting that she was happier in general. She had that sense of self-efficacy, that she could overcome things, that she could cope with things and manage things. The relationship between the caregivers and this child was reported as being better, as being stronger. So it felt like a really nice example there of where something that's quite simple and straightforward and low intensity that might typically have been written off as appropriate could be incredibly effective, not just for the difficulty, but have those ripple effects. A couple of other examples. I need to draw things to a close in a minute, so we've got enough time for the reflections, but a couple of other examples in here. So this next example was a piece of work that a clinical psychologist who was working in a looked after children's team delivered. So I was providing some supervision for her, and she was working with this young person, and there was some trauma in the mix, but they were really quite low as well. And so we discussed what might be able to be done around the low mood. And behavioural activation, for those who don't know, again, is a fairly, on the surface of it, a fairly straightforward behavioural approach to managing low mood. So there are 2 key components to it. So the first one is identifying the link between activities and your mood, and then looking at activities that you have the capacity and scope to build into your week that boost your mood, boost your enjoyment, your sense of achievement, your sense of closeness to other people. And the behavioural activation model recognises that there might be life events that have happened that have led to you feeling low, and it's absolutely understandable that you would feel low on the back of those life events, and it would empathise with those life events, but recognise that they're beyond our gift to change or do anything about. But what we might be able to do something about is things that you're doing in your week that can make you feel better in mood in a more sustainable way. So that's the first stage of behavioural activation. The second stage of behavioural activation is then looking at the kind of activities or things that you get drawn into doing when you feel low to try to cope or manage with that mood at the time that might ultimately be counterproductive. So that can include things like self-harm or alcohol or drug use, arguments with people, withdrawing, disconnecting socially, all those kind of things. And it systematically looks at those and just unpicks them with the young person to identify how they might be counterproductive, and then thinks about alternative things that you might be able to do at those times, maybe that serve similar functions, but that lift your mood in a more sustainable way and a more life-enhancing way. So quite a simple, straightforward approach. But again, I think for children in care, and with this particular example, had a really, really significant impact on their mood and their level of fulfillment and value in life. Last example, and then I'll zip it. It's really hard because I can't see anyone at all while I'm running the slides, so I hope that we haven't lost too many of the audience. So this was an example with a young person that I worked in when I was in the specialist team a few years back. So this was a girl who was at early secondary school age. She'd been in foster care for a few years, come into foster care with a couple of siblings, and was placed with her middle sibling in this particular foster placement. And the background to her coming into foster care without, and I'm trying to give enough detail that it gives you an illustration, but without breaching people's confidentiality. But the background to her coming into care, which might be a familiar story, quite a common story. So there had been neglect, single parent family, there had been neglect, and there had been periods where the children were left in the house on their own for prolonged periods of time, so days at a time. And she was 7 or 8 at the time. She was the oldest sibling. There'd been a particular incident that had led to her coming into care. So there was an awful lot of that taking on a carer role, really struggling to relinquish that, but lots of guilt, lots of trauma memories around some of these incidents that happened while they were left unaccompanied by an adult. So we actually did some trauma-focused CBT together. And the way that we approach this. So one of the things I would say is I did use a lot of the interpersonal skills that I'd learned through dyadic developmental psychotherapy. So I do think that was a benefit here. However, I do think those skills are still interpersonal skills that you would be using when you deliver CBT anyway. And we developed a PowerPoint, her choice. So we developed a PowerPoint of her life, which included some slides around these traumatic events, which gave us some opportunity to re-script some of the beliefs that she'd had at the time, but also that she'd been left with around those traumatic events, and continued into what her life's like now and what her aspirations are for the future. So it kind of placed the trauma in a timeline, but did some of those core components of trauma-focused CBT as well. And I think any purist CBT therapist looking in on it would have recognized it as a piece of trauma-focused CBT, but it was delivered in quite a creative way. And I think that's one of the things with CBT, particularly in trauma-focused CBT, is that I think often it can be seen as quite a rigid approach, lacking any flexibility or creativity, and actually it can be delivered in really creative ways. So I've used collaging, I've used play, used the PowerPoint with this young person. So lots of different ways that you can utilize to actually deliver the core bits. So we developed this PowerPoint. Her own trauma symptoms reduced significantly. Her sense of guilt and responsibility for her sibling reduced significantly, to the point that she was able to relinquish some of that to the foster carers. Unfortunately, the placement broke down for the younger sibling and she was moved to a different foster placement, but the particular young person I'd done this work with stayed in placement, and actually her resilience and her coping when her younger sibling moved from the placement was huge, and I don't think would have been the same without this piece of work. So the other thing that we also did with this piece of work, again, her choice, is that we had a session where she presented the PowerPoint back to her social worker and to her foster carers. Incredibly powerful session, and had a massive impact in terms of her relationship with her social carer, her social worker and her foster carer. Just deepened that understanding and that sensitivity, and I think felt quite cathartic for her, as she had some mastery over this trauma by this point as well. So I hope that they've been useful, just to put those couple of examples in. I think we just felt it would be helpful to illustrate some of the points in the guide and illustrate the impact that some of those evidence-based, difficulty-specific interventions can make in quite a complex picture.
Thank you, Gavin. Really interesting and rich presentation. So thank you, and really great to bring it to life at the end with some real practice examples of the application of some of this. We've got about 55 minutes left, and within the programme we've got some opportunity now for some questions and discussion around what you've heard through both presentations, and then we've got a little bit more of a structured conversation with some questions that we can put to you. But just wanted to open up the meeting now for any questions. If we can just use the protocol that I'm sure you're all familiar with now, by the raising of the hand, and then I'll attempt to bring everyone in. And as Lila said at the beginning of the meeting, Andrea isn't here and has been the real lead for this, so we will do our best to answer questions and absolutely come back to people outside of this with materials and questions through a frequently asked question fact sheet, as it were, to get those answers if we're not able to answer them ourselves as part of this group. So I see Lynn, your hand's up.
Thank you very much. I'm Lynn Ferguson, Director of Social Care and Early Help for Achieving for Children, which provides services for Windsor and Maidenhead. I was really struck with what you were saying about the fact, and I actually agree with it, that not all children in care or care leavers require therapy. And I think from a social work perspective, I'll be bold enough as to say we sometimes do try and shoehorn all of our children in care into needing some therapy. The bit I was struck with was the need for good consultation for our social work and early help staff. I think that is really, really important. You know, my ideal, if I was sort of thinking into the future, my ideal would be to have particular individuals located with our social work teams. That would be the dream, and I think that would work really effectively. You know, I think we'd have to work through some barriers and silos to get to that point, but I think if we're really all thinking about children, young people, I think that would be a really, really helpful way forward. So for me, I agree with what you're saying. I think the focus has really got to be, yes, having the therapeutic support in place for those young people who need it, but having that consultation for staff working with young people so that the system, the team around the child, is able to support that child in perhaps a slightly different way. So I'm really, really keen to explore what that could look like. Thank you.
Thanks, Lynn. That's a really helpful comment. I think that the two things can absolutely go both ways. Also, one of the things that I'm trying to at least pilot within Sussex at the moment is whether or not we could ask social workers to join our duty and liaison teams who go into hospitals, who do the self-harm assessments on young people who present in those circumstances, because very rarely does a child, and they're obviously not all children in care, but certainly they have got, they're often got complexities, need to have multi-agency involvement. And if we could have from the very beginning a joint education, social care, health perspective on the needs of that young person, rather than the multiple assessments and the scenario where we're looking across the table at one another as to who's going to blink first in terms of taking responsibility for the child. I think there's so much to be achieved through that interagency working and that assessment from the get-go, really, on our most vulnerable children.
May I just
Gavin?
come in there as well?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, I'm just gonna absolutely agree with what you're both saying, and I think just thinking about one of the principles in the guide around acceptance, curiosity, and empathy, and I was at pains to emphasise between professional colleagues as well, and I just sort of reflecting historically around some of the absolutely well-intentioned drive to get therapy for a young person in care, but what's behind that drive, and some of that is around maybe a lack of confidence or comfort with continuing to work with the young person yourself or continuing to support the young person yourself, and some of that might also be because of the level of trauma the young person's giving, which can be really upsetting to hear. So I think there's something built into the consultation as well about it isn't just consultation from an expert perspective, but it's some of that emotional and wellbeing support for the people who are going to continue working with that young person and supporting that young person as well.
Thanks, Gavin. Lila?
Yeah, I just want to come in. So I worked with consultation models previously, Lynn, and actually they seem to be working quite well for complex children, complex presentations. And I think one thing that we've learned is that sort of initial assessment consultation is really, really important to get right, because then you can then support staff as well. They might be doing some of those interventions that Gavin has just discussed, and actually give them some confidence to do those interventions, which I think is also really important in any model going forward that we want to discuss. Consultation models are often quite sustainable, quite cost effective, easier to maintain in terms of staff turnover, that sort of thing.
If I may just add one other thing, so as I say, we consulted extensively in pulling together the guide, and one of the pleas or requests from some of those working looked after children's services was around getting that consultation in as early as possible. So rather than it being something that was identified in a plan and comes on the back of the plan, actually engaging that consultation before the plan's even made.
Yeah, I agree.
So that, yeah.
Okay, are there any other questions or comments that people wanted to make before we move on to the discussion?
I think John's got his hand up.
Oh yeah, John.
See.
Okay, go ahead.
And one other.
Hi, thanks. John McLaughlin, I'm Chief Exec of Response. We provide supported housing for 16 to 24-year-olds across Oxfordshire, and we're also part of the statutory CAMS mental health skills team's approach in Oxfordshire. I'm just a little bit confused because throughout all the presentations I'm hearing, it's sort of young people described as 0 to 25, and NHS England and Department of Justice have just launched their scoping exercise into complex young people and the support they require, and it only goes to 18. So the whole system can't seem to agree on the definition of a young person. And from my experience in the time we've been involved, that 16 to 24-year-old age group are the least supported in the community. I'm just thoughts we've got NHS England on. We've got, why are we running a scoping exercise that stops at 18, which is supposedly going to identify investment over the next 10 years?
I don't know, John, if there's anyone who's been involved in that guidance that you're referring to that stops at 18. Lola.
So I've been party to on the fringes, and unfortunately Peter, I think, has left the meeting. Peter Gates, who is leading that piece of work from Health and Justice Commissioning. But I think what we can promise you, John, is that on the back of this is that we could have a conversation with the specialist commissioners in the general around how we see complex children and young people, because it is absolutely right. We should be thinking 0 to 25. And I think what we learn, and I'm sure Lynn would agree with this, is by the time some young people are ready to engage with things, they're nearly 18. And that's where then, there's nothing available. So we need to think much more 0 to 25. Having said all that, I think the scoping piece of work is still really fantastic progress. And so I think,
yeah, but unfortunately, Lila, it comes back. It is, that is going to identify where the funding's going to go for the next 10 years. And if that funding doesn't identify 18 to 24-year-olds as a significant part of the population, then we've really missed the trick.
Yeah, no, but I don't disagree. But I think what we can, and I'm sure Andrea would agree with this, we can, in the background, have a conversation with our colleagues around how important it is to think 0 to 25. But obviously, that piece of work is not a piece of work that we are leading on.
I mean, certainly from an adult mental health perspective, I think there is a huge way to go to really properly understand the needs of care leavers, actually not to 25, but beyond 25, well into adulthood, and to really understand the impact of being in care on you as an individual and your need to access services. So I think some of the challenge is that I don't think it is necessarily well understood amongst adult mental health services. I've asked the question about, do we record it on our clinical systems for adults, whether or not anyone is care experienced? Is it an overt conversation that happens if someone as an adult presents to mental health services? Is there a discussion about their experiences of being in care? Is there a way for us to be able to quantify even what the numbers of people who have experience of being in care is amongst those who are on caseloads of our adult mental health service? And certainly within Sussex Partnership, we do not record that anywhere. So it's really difficult to properly understand the needs of an adult in terms of what that impact of being in care has had on them, and then need to access those services. So I think there's a long way to go before we properly understand it. And I think 18 to 25 is just the start. So I think the good thing is the NHS long-term plan for CAMHS talks about 18 to 25 and 16 to 25, and is a priority for the ICS work streams. I think we need to make sure in our individual ICSs that we prioritise this as an area of focus, and really support really good transition for young people from CAM services into adult services, and to make sure they can access mainstream adult mental health where their needs are properly understood. So I think there's a real long way to go, and certainly my conversation with Andrea, when I asked her to share with me some areas of good practice around care leavers, where care leavers particularly had shaped the services for them, she was really struggling to find areas nationwide who had done this well. So I think we've got a really long way to go.
Thank you.
Okay, so it looks as if there's no more hands up. Lynn, I assume, is yours an old hand, or
it's a new hand, if that's
a new
okay?
hand?
And it's
Yeah,
just a quickie, really. I just wanted to say I agree totally with what John has said. You know, I think for some of our young people there is a cliff edge at 18. And that is really concerning. And I absolutely agree that for our care leavers, they have got the least ability really to access good emotional wellbeing support if they need it. So it really is an area of focus. In terms of adult services, I just want to say in Windsor Maidenhead, we are currently in the process of doing some complex transitional work. It's a really big project between us and Achieving for Children and Optalis, who deliver adult social care, because we've acknowledged it really is an area we've got to improve. So I think there is a long way to go. I think you're right, but you know, certainly we are trying to do something a bit more creative about how we can sort of banish this cliff edge, because it is a concern.
Thank you, Lynn. Martin, you've come in. Anything you wanted to add?
Yes, I have a relatively ignorant question. I work as a commissioner in East Sussex and work across Sussex in practice for those who I haven't met previously, for children, young people, mental health. So the question is about, or the discussion is around looked after children, and also about the, you know, preparing adult mental health services and well-being services. Is it not so that the discussion is wider in that context around adverse childhood experience, as opposed to looked after children alone? And you know, I speak as someone who does do a little bit of work in adult mental health care. It's highly relevant, but I also see that the issues that that present in adult mental health services is wider than looked after children alone.
Gavin, did you want to come in from a clinical perspective around this?
Yeah, so I suppose I was thinking two things as you were speaking, Martin. So one is, it absolutely chimes with what we were saying earlier around children on the edge of care, and post-adoption, who may have very similar needs in terms of mental health and emotional well-being to children in care. So that was one thought as you were speaking. The other thought, Martin, was around making the distinction between adverse childhood experiences and the impacts that those adverse childhood experiences have had. So we know that the percentage of children who will have experienced some adverse childhood experiences is high. The the proportion who will then go on to develop mental health or complex mental health difficulties or attachment-based difficulties on the back of those is slightly lower. And I think it's probably that group that we're talking about here.
Okay.
Okay, any more questions or comments before we move on to the next section of the event? No? Okay. Anna Maria, I don't know if you have the questions ready to display that we wanted just to pose to the group. And Gavin, Lila, I know you've done previous events of these. Are we doing this as a whole group? I assume we're not splitting into smaller groups.
I don't think we have facility to
No,
do
doesn't look
breakout
like.
rooms, Rachel, no. So
No.
we might just have a combination of conversation and chat bar.
Okay, that's great. So do we have those questions that we wanted to just use as a prompt to structure some of the conversation? Great, thank you. So we've got 3 questions here. How does the evidence-based guide support your onward design of children in care emotional and mental health service offer? And how do you think social care and CAMS could be more closely aligned or integrated in your local area? How can the access of children in care to timely EMH support, recognising the pressures of surge and impact on outcomes for these children, be monitored and reviewed by both commissioners and providers? And how is your relationship with CMHT lead commissioners developing to support care leaver EMH design? Is there any more support you need in this regard? So I suppose the first one, if we just take one at a time, how, given what Gavin has outlined this morning, how do you think it might affect your onward design of your offer for children in care? Do you think that it could inform a different approach? Will it galvanise what you're already doing? Just be interested in people's reflections as to how practically that may well be used within your areas, both in terms of whether you're a provider, whether you're a clinician or a commissioner, whatever perspective you come to the meeting with. Chantal.
Hi Rachel, hi everyone. I'm Chantal Homan, the service manager with Southampton CAM Services. And I'm just trying to get my hand down, but my mouse has got stuck. I'll worry about that in a minute. Thank you for that, Gavin. That was really, really helpful. And I guess the comment that I wanted to make actually fits nicely with question 1. So for me, I think it really strengthens my resolve to be thinking around trauma-informed practice as a system here in Southampton, rather than as a CAM service. And we've started some conversations about it. And I think with COVID, we've been a bit kind of stop, start, and kind of making a go at it, thinking about who to pull in and how do we get a trauma-informed approach across Southampton City as a system, so that we kind of really stick with this idea that children who are looked after are able to access any service that best suits their first need around their mental health, rather than the fact that they happen to be a child who are looked after, but that we kind of strengthen the approach and the understanding of everybody across the system to be working with children who are looked after and kind of see their unique needs alongside who they are first and foremost. So I think I'm going to go away from here. And we do have another kind of trauma-informed practice group coming up, and I think I'm going to be bringing this into there to really sort of start driving our thinking a bit more about where we go from this. Now I've got steamed up glasses because I'm talking. This is really going well, isn't it? And in terms of how CAMS and social care become more closely aligned with that, really just sort of pushing that it needs to be a joint pathway, joint thinking, joint training the whole way through. So yeah, it's a thank you mostly for this. I think it really strengthens some local discussions.
Thanks, Chantal. Gavin, did you want to come in on what Chantal's just said?
Yeah, if that's okay. I mean, that's really fantastic to hear, Chantal. Wider than children in care, trauma-informed practice or trauma-informed approaches seems to be a real buzz at the moment in relation to COVID and things too. And I think so we know that Public Health England are doing a lot of work around this. There's been a regional working party who did some work around this and came up with a set of principles around any trauma-informed approach, including trauma-informed training. So it might be worth linking in with your local PHE lead about that as well. I think one of the things that's come out of those, or two of those things that have come out of the conversations from meetings that I've been in, one is to be really, really clear what we mean by trauma-informed approach or trauma-informed practice, because it feels like it's one of those umbrella terms that could mean a whole bunch of different things to a whole bunch of different people. So something about really operationalizing it and pinning down what we mean. And I think we sort of identified a core component of that has to be the way that people are approaching the relationships that they have with each other and with children and young people. The other bit that I think is really reassuring to hear in what you're saying, Chantal, is making sure that there is also consideration of how do you identify when a young person is experiencing more significant trauma reactions, such as PTSD or complex PTSD, and that you are confident that your system can identify that, and that there is a pathway for those young people to be referred on and get evidence-based interventions for that where it's present. So it's really reassuring to hear that you're sort of thinking across the whole of that pathway, because sometimes it feels like maybe that bit gets dropped off.
Thanks, Gavin. John, you were next with your hand.
Thanks. Just a couple of reflections, kind of generally across all three questions. We work very closely with statutory CAMs and the local sort of statutory organisations in Oxfordshire, and one of the biggest benefits of that has been the access to really good training for third sector staff, and I think COVID has given us a real opportunity to actually roll out training more broadly to the third sector from statutory organisations, because everyone's using Teams. It's much easier to access, it's much easier, more flexible for the third sector. So, I would plea with anybody from statutory organisations is open up your training, give the third sector access to it, because they will help with your surge and dealing with the surge going forward. That would be my plea. And I think as the commissioners on here equally, you can mandate to providers that their staff have certain training before you award contracts for any children, young people services. So I think when we start as commissioners saying, actually, we won't place children until you can demonstrate that your staff have, whether it be, CBT or trauma-informed approach, you can mandate that in the award of contracts. That's just my reflection.
Thank you, John. And I think one of the, I don't know how much people know about a really key aspect of the work that Andrea's been championing regionally, particularly with directors of children's services across the southeast, is a joint procurement approach to placements. So that's very much about ensuring that there is almost a minimum therapeutic standard, which details a lot of what you've just described in terms of ensuring that staff do have that minimum level of training and understanding, they have the skills and qualifications to work with our young people. Because I think we've probably all got experience of too many providers who turn themselves as a therapeutic placement, and the definition of that is perhaps a few chickens in the back garden and actually some real questionable concerns. And then what happens is that particularly those areas of the country that have a high number of those providers then end up, the provider ends the local authority ends up having to pay twice, because they pay the provider who's supposedly providing a level of therapeutic input, and then that child is also referred to the local CAM service, and that puts huge pressure on local services also. So I think there's the extra strand that I've just mentioned that Andrea's leading, I'm hoping will pay real dividends around the commissioning of placements and us having much more faith in the quality of the therapeutic input to that. So, and what you say, John, is absolutely spot on. We need to use our third sector partners really to support the CAM surge, both the COVID suppressed and the COVID generated, because all roads cannot lead to CAMs. So, absolutely support what you're saying. Okay, I think we had Sonia next.
Hi, I'll apologise now. I'm dealing with an instance, so I might be called away and have to come back, but I'll start. So just to say that in terms of some of the things you've shared, really helpful, and just made me think about some of the very good work that's going on in Portsmouth. So we do have schools that are trained in PACE, and we're looking at developing the DDP model and a trauma-informed model where people are trained at different levels across the city. That's all providers for schools, education, and we've got a whole range of training in place around that. We have the trauma-informed model of care that was led by Anna Draper, and again that was a model for UAMS, but we've rolled that out through our through care teams as well. So again, it does look at things like post-traumatic stress disorder, and there's a Fast Feet Forward as an element of that programme that's rolled out, and that training again is for all partners, it's for foster carers, it's spread across the city. We've got the Mockingbird project in place, so they're using it in with the foster carers as well. So we are doing quite a lot of work there, and I'll try and catch up with Chantel, because one of the psychologists in adult mental health in Portsmouth is leading on a trauma-informed model for the city, and he's obviously works for Solent, so we'll see what involvement there might be and things that they could use in Southampton as well as part of that model of care as well. But quite a lot of work going on really around that trauma-informed model and the relationship-based stuff that you've talked about as well, Gavin, which was really helpful, and lots of consultations. And we're fortunate that the local authority do offer funding for a LAC team, so they offer consultation, supervision, training to foster carers as quite a wide offer. One of the challenges we have is that when children are moved out of area, they're saying, well, why can't we have what we get in Portsmouth? But again, everything is commissioned differently, so I do understand that. And the consultation to the foster carers to the residential settings, it does make a real difference in terms of planning packages of care for young people. I managed to say that being called out.
And well done for multitasking, at least having your focus on one thing. So thanks for that. And it's really good to hear what's happening in Portsmouth, and good news that the Director of Children's Services in Portsmouth is coming over to East Sussex, and I'm hoping some of that joint approach will be spread there too. So yeah, really good to hear. So thanks, Sonia.
Yeah, and we're working a bit more on integration as a whole model across the city as well, and looking at how we'll do that. So yeah, that should help as well.
Yeah, definite sector leaders around that integrated social care, local authority, health approach. You can absolutely see that it comes through in the way that services are provided. Rebecca, you're next with your hand up.
Thank you very much. Yeah, really useful presentation and information. I'm Senior Specialist Educational Psychologist for Wellbeing and Manager of the Wellbeing Team in the Royal Borough of Windsor and Maidenhead. Just a few sort of thoughts and comments really. In Windsor and Maidenhead, we're currently working on a sort of graduated approach, incorporating sort of preventative approaches alongside what early help can bring into the mix, and then also the sort of consultation approach and development of that, linking in with education, with CAMS and social care as well. So that's in development at the moment. Also just really interested to hear and think further about the use of VIG, the Video Interactive Guidance. And I definitely see a role for that with families, but also use with staff within our own teams as well. I think there's possibly some real nice development opportunities there in terms of supporting staff in the conversations and consultations they're having, and what we can learn from the use of video interactive guidance on that front. Really useful to sort of understand as we move forward as part of our graduated sort of approach, actually then, you know, those further pathways, as has already been mentioned really. So for example, in terms of the trauma focused CBT, which would sit outside what we can deliver as a local authority, where would that sort of come from? Is there sort of funding for that, and what would that look like? And just lastly, just a thought around the PACE acronym and why playfulness wasn't incorporated in that, in terms of that being something that's often lost with children, young people, young adults who are looked after. So I was just curious as to why that wasn't included, and also obviously important in staff discussions as well, in terms of use of that in consultation.
Thanks, Rebecca. I don't know if, Gavin, you've got an immediate response to what Rebecca's just said, or Lila?
Yeah, no, agree, absolutely agree, Becky. You know, having a background in DDP, the playfulness bit is so critical. I think it was a conscious decision not to include it in the principles, just because of how that can be interpreted. So when you know, it's one of those, I don't know, kind of, to me it feels like one of those things where if you know what it means and you apply it in a attuned and sensitive way, it's brilliant and it works really well. But if you misunderstand what it means and you just apply it in a blanket, ill-considered way, it can spectacularly backfire and be incredibly dismissive or invalidating. So that was the only. So it's not because we didn't view it as important. It was just in terms of who the audience was and how would they interpret it and use that.
Layla.
Just wondering whether it was worth bringing in sort of one of the perennial problems with that links to question 1 is around placement stability. So Gavin touched upon that in his guide. So what we often hear, and I think is one of the challenges to accessing mental health support, is there's requirement to be in the stable placement, and we know for this cohort particularly that can be quite difficult to achieve. So how do we think differently? How does systems respond differently to that particular challenge? I think would be quite interesting if anybody had any thoughts in this meeting.
Well, certainly from my perspective, I think, and I can't emphasize it enough, and I know we've talked about it a bit during this morning, is about the value of consultation to other professionals. So not necessarily the importance of having a child in a room being theraped, as it were, but actually really providing a good support to those both professionals and, really importantly, their carers around them, whether it's their foster carer, whether they're in residential care, about how to achieve that placement stability and really to provide that authentic parenting approach to the child. So that would certainly be my perspective. It doesn't have to be about getting a child having individual one-to-one work, very much so it's about the network around them. But I see Gavin and Lynn have put their hands up in response to that specifically. Lynn, yeah, I think you were first.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think we've said before that really early consultation, I think, is absolutely key. But, you know, as I'm listening to all of this morning, what I'm really thinking is this is very much about hearts and minds. So, you know, we want a sort of a strengths-based, solution-focused approach to dealing with this issue. And what happens is that we sometimes get into discussions about who's ultimately responsible, who should pay, and these sorts of discussions really, really get in the way, and they block us sort of focusing on what's right for the child. So for me, a lot of this is about having different conversations, thinking differently, having flexibility in the system, having the child at the centre. And I don't always think that is there, because we do get into these very lengthy debates about, you know, is this a social care need? You know, is it a mental health need? Well, actually, for some of these young people, it will be a bit of everything. And we need to probably stop having those conversations and have different conversations about how we can collectively support those individuals. So I do think there is some work to be done there. I think there's a lot of will in the system, but we do need to have, I think, at a senior level, different conversations.
Absolutely. Gavin, just in response to Layla's point.
I completely agree with Lynn about winning hearts and minds. Absolutely. And I hope what we didn't say at the beginning is we've run a few of these events. So we've run an event for IROs and senior social workers. We've run an event for clinical leads out in services. This is our 3rd event now. We're trying to engage with trainers of social workers as well across the region, all as part of this wider picture of winning hearts and minds. Just on the placement stability question, I just wanted to comment on that, Rachel. So we had in the slides around complexity, and that sometimes complexity can act as a barrier to accessing evidence-based interventions that other children would have access to. I also think placement stability can act in the same way. So I absolutely agree with what you were saying, Rachel, about where placements aren't stable, how critical it is to be doing that consultation and supporting the system around the young person. However, I do also think that there can be some young people where you can still where you can still deliver a really useful and effective piece of work one-to-one, and placement instability shouldn't act as a barrier to that as a given. So there's a lot of conversation around internal and external stability. So and both mutually affect one another. So actually, if it is possible to do a piece of one-to-one work with a young person, I know I'm banging on around trauma, but say you do a piece of work around PTSD, and the young person starts to have more internal stability as a result of that, that's going to have a ripple effect on the placement security. And we know there are some young people where actually their placements may never be stable. So we're just saying that we're going to deny them an intervention for the whole of their childhood. There's a middle ground here, I think.
Thank
Sorry,
you,
I've got in a
Gavin.
bit of a soapbox there, Rachel.
Yeah, no, it's really important stuff, and certainly I've been on both sides of the fence where I know it causes huge amount of frustration. So yeah, really important to name it and discuss it. Jenny, I realise you've been leapfrogged a couple of times, so I want to make sure we bring you in.
Thanks very much. I think that's fine, Rachel. If you'd have brought me in, I would have said I would have held back, because I think that was a really important conversation. That was a sort of a two-way narrative anyway, so it's absolutely fine. But and I did want to just pick up on the bit about effective relationships in systems, because I think that the narrative about commissioning as something very separate to provision and design can be quite unhelpful. And I think we probably need to do more to embrace what was traditional commissioning into a new world of kind of joined up service design, because the bit in my background is mental health service provision. I spent 14 years in provision of mental health services. My first job was in CAM services actually, but and also have a background in clinical psychology. And I think that what's often misunderstood about kind of traditional commissioning is that it's about population health outcomes and how you design and move resources around the ultimate need, as opposed to just procuring and paying and etc. So I think as those components of what CCGs have done in the past fall away in the new design space, I think there's a real opportunity for us to be the kind of convener of systems and to bring people together in a new way. And I think that we are naturally compartmentalized by the NHS at every level, in every place, wherever you go, people want to put what you do into a box or into a silo, and it's really difficult to maintain effective relationships across all that complexity. I really worry about how we make sure we don't count our workforce 15 times, for example. I see it in our system. I think I've got 7 or 8 different cohorts of groups, people, teams, systems within systems, who all think they're going to lean on the same 20 new people that are going to come into the system and use them in a new way. So it's about how we pull everyone together onto the same page. But I also think that if we don't take the world of provider collaboratives and that learning around what it really means to co-design and into local system shaped informal provider collaboratives, I guess, and embrace the kind of the resources that commissioning has into that space, we're going to really struggle to make effective use of it, because whilst we need to get into specifically what individual people, children, patients need, we also need to step back and go, actually, at whole population level, where is that acute need? Where does it need to be? And I worry about the divorced bit of the acute provider world. And whenever there is a new and different problem, that it often gets worked out first in an acute world. And the resources that we could be using much more broadly in the community get sucked into an acute phase of someone doing it, and we just get stuck in this perpetual cycle of treating the worst component of illness instead of making sure that we do allow kind of prevention and early intervention to really flourish. So we've got to kind of get a fire break in there as well. But just really that sort of plea to kind of to bring everybody into that kind of co-design space.
Yeah. Thanks, Jenny. And I think that probably talks to point 2, which is about also the impact on outcomes for the children. And Jasmine, I've seen your comment in the chat about the work that you've got around the Edge of Care team. And I think I just wondered if you're able just to talk a little bit more about that and some of the outcomes of that and evidence and impact. I think it would be quite interesting to hear about that specific focus.
Hi, I'm Jasmine Grimshaw from Wokingham, Service Manager Corporate Parenting. Yeah, we initiated a compass team that all our workers are, all the workers within the team, and the team consists of a team manager that is social work trained, psychologist, and 3 other workers that are not social work trained. And it's been up and running for about a year. We're just sort of like reviewing where we are. The Edge of Care team work closely in terms of placement stability around our foster placements. So in terms of the reduction, I mean, we've seen that there's been a reduction in terms of their input, working with families around foster carers in terms of placement moves and trying to work with the foster carers to understand and support them in terms of managing some of the behaviours that the children are displaying in terms of the trauma that they've experienced, and trying to understand how that is impacting on their behaviours, so that we've seen some really positive outcomes in terms of that. In terms of keeping children out of care, that we've seen some I mean, it still remains early days, but it has been working in terms of working with families. And alongside that, it's also helped. It's also this evidence to suggest, and we've got that this is avoided children going into high cost placements as well. So trying to keep them either within the foster placement or keeping them at home. So this, yeah, it's early days, but it is really good. All of the, as I said, all of the workers have undertaken the trauma informed training, systemically trained as well. Provide case consultation as well, so they don't necessarily pick up cases, but for the social work team, provide that sort of provide case consultation about how to move forward with families to prevent children coming into care. Sorry, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now? Sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's really good to hear about the way in which that's developed. I mean, is there anything else that this group could do, or the work that you've heard about this morning, that can enhance what you're doing and perhaps extend the reach of some of those outcomes?
I suppose obviously if there is any further suggestions, yeah, that would be great. I mean, we are considering it's only in its early stages really, but we are considering how we can reach that out to our care leavers.
Thank you. Lisa, I've got your hand up.
Thank you. It kind of comes on the back of much of what's been said. I think everybody's kind of in agreement around, progressing more integrated working, joint pathways, trauma-informed care across the system, etc. I'm just wondering if there's any information or knowledge out there around culture change, because and where that fits, or how people have actually managed to implement these systems, because my sense is that some cohorts might be absolutely with it and others might go, this is more than my job, etc., and have that resistance. And it does feel like, I could be wrong, but it feels like this is more than just pathways and processes and protocols and service specifications. It does feel like underpinning it is some kind of culture change. Yeah. Any experience of that out there that people could share?
From my perspective, Lisa, I don't think you can beat co-location and professionals working alongside one another. And I think the real challenge around that and those multidisciplinary teams is that, how do we, if I can use the analogy, how do we retain the lively fruit salad and not end up with some sort of soup that everyone is the same, but really contribute something specific to that team? And I don't think you can replicate the value of that in any other way. One of the things that we've done locally, which I think has worked really well, is some specific events around legal frameworks. So for CAM staff to do some work with social workers and others around the Mental Health Act and what it means to be detained, and the different powers there might be under Section 136, for example. And equally, there's been then a joint sharing session around the Children Act and what it means to become accommodated, what it means to be looked after under a care order, and then the potential around things like secure secure orders, so that there is at least some better understanding across agencies as to the limitations that we're all working within in terms of those legal frameworks. So from my perspective, I think probably co-location and really understanding one another's world is a good place to start. But I imagine there are probably lots of people on the call who've got experiences of doing it and making that shift. So I'll be interested to hear from anyone who has achieved that. Layla.
So I think there are, apart from that, I actually agree with low co-location. You know, is a key driver for that culture change. But I think it's probably worth thinking about your local transformation plan as well as being one of the tools to enable that culture change. And you'd also have a children's plan, your health and well-being plan, as key sort of culture changing settings. Just with this particular piece of work, what you do have is all the local authority directors have all signed up to this. So that's a really good key starting point. And the other thing that's happened across the South East in the last 2 years is signing up to restorative practice as systems. So you start getting into a different space when you talk about your tricky things that you need to unpick and resolve and design services around. So those are some of the key things I recommend, and particularly with restorative practices, that sort of you're not doing to, you're doing with. This is all our issue. So in my previous job, I would view some of the difficulties that social care colleagues were having as also my issues, that everybody, it takes everybody to come to the table to resolve this for this cohort. And actually, you know, for most of the issues that we're faced with, and particularly COVID with the surge, it will take all of us to solve it if we can.
Thanks. Gavin.
Yeah, I'm just going to share a couple of reflections on your point about co-location, Rachel, from having been in a couple of teams that were multi-agency where we're co-located. So I think one thing that seemed to work especially well is having a management or a steering group that had the senior leads from the different stakeholders all on board and talking to one another and fleshing out some of the differences and that clear vision ahead of time, actually, if possible. There was something around line management. So like you say, how do you keep that fruit salad without it becoming a mushed up soup? So how do you protect some of the roles and remit, but also have line management that is still consistent to the overall vision for the team, rather than people feeling like they're still pulled back towards their own agency in terms of what they're doing? I think the third thing that felt like it worked really well is then when you are doing outreach back into the agencies of origin for the workers in the team, but you could double up. So for example, you know, I would go into our local social care teams with the social worker from our team, so it was almost like social worker plus guest. So you kind of get that in with the team, and then that introduces them to those multi-agency perspectives, and ditto, you know, bringing the social worker along to CAMS meetings. It just seemed to work really well to smooth the way there.
Yeah, I don't think anything beats those personal relationships to be able to achieve that. Andy, you've got your hand up.
Hi everybody, Andy Fitton from Berkshire West CCG, Assistant Director for Joint Commissioning. Couple of reflections on the sort of the conversation just rolling around my head. So the first one, in terms of, I think, the question around people at distance, placed at distance, and the breakdown of placements. I think the challenge for us as health providers or health commissioners is to be able to get inside the detail of those social care processes and understanding how we work alongside those. And I think there is a real, I suppose, the challenge for all of us is to think about how we co-work those situations as best we possibly can. How they spot placement breakdowns, how they then will react to placement breakdowns. But I'm not entirely sure or convinced that those come as properly, so as collaborative moments across the system. They're often obviously very anxiety fueled and quite panicked, because we've got to then knee-jerk reaction to find a new placement process. So I think that would be a reflection about how we create systems responses in those moments, which are very anxiety fueled. And then money gets in the way is always the other thing. So how do we move that on? The other reflection I've got in terms of when people are making placements, and I think it's been iterated, but I would say is when that's happening in local authorities, it's often a set of people that aren't social workers that are placement finders, and whether we've got them with the right info, because it's not just the social worker will provide a profile of the child, but often in local authorities there's a team of people who are commissioning, not in the sense of how we do it in health, but often our placement finders who will then do it. So how are we also aligned to them inside local authorities, not just social workers, is a critical bit, because they are making decisions about the quality and availability of that placement in a very tense, difficult environment, trying to do cost and provision at the same time. And I'm not convinced we've got the right advice available to them, because they're not specialists in this respect. So they're often not always necessarily practitioners background, they're commissioners. Then the two other thoughts I had at the end sort of thing is, one is maybe more challenging, is I think the maturity bit for us in Berkshire West, the next steps, because we're getting to the point where we're getting a much more bespoke offer in mental health that we're looking for children in care, is actually how do we tie this together to have a holistic health offer across both physical and mental health. Because if you're listening to children through this process, and what they're saying is they don't see it as separated out. Today, I think that's something that I feel we're missing talking about, is how's that happening. It's been obviously a good strength on mental health, but actually a lot of young people are talking about their physical health needs and their entitlement within the health system. And I think that's particularly true of care leavers as they become young adults. How do they feel confident to get their whole health entitlement and how to access that? And I think that's missing from the conversation. And I'm not sure I'm seeing NHS England folk talk about it in that same way. And then I think the other thing that is that, and I mean this in the best way, is I don't hear much in the guidance about what young people have told us about what works for them. So I think we've done a lot of clinical guidance, which is great. But actually underneath it, there's something else that how we think about what young people are telling us and how we're co-producing service offers that actually tells us about the mode of delivery, the approach of delivery, the style of delivery, the relationships and what they want, the consistency of what they need. And I'm not sure I'm hearing that today either. And I think that's something that I've been hit when I've talked to young people in the last 6 months who are children in care and care leavers. Some of their feedback and reflections on the system is when it's worked well and when it hasn't worked well. I'm not sure I'm seeing that in the guidance, and whether that should be something that we should ask for some reflection, come in saying, what are young people telling us about the way they want services to be delivered for them going forward?
Absolutely. I think, Andy, thank you. Those are some really really important challenges and questions for us to consider, and I think that the time now doesn't allow us to probably answer that, and maybe we don't have the answers to all of that, but certainly through my early work trying to understand what care leavers are telling us about the services that they want as to become adults, there really isn't much evidence out there. So I think there's a long way to go with that, and I couldn't agree more with you about the people around placement finding, and have they necessarily got the right inputs to be able to make that balance between the availability of that placement and the quality of what's on offer. So lots of really helpful challenges there. Really conscious of time, we've just got 3 minutes left, so no more hands are up. I just wondered if I could hand over either to Gavin or Layla just to think about next steps and how this work's taken forward and how people can continue to keep involved and to be part of this work.
I think that's probably one for you, Gavin, as you've been involved from the beginning with this.
Yes, well, so from conversations with Andrea, I think our intention was that these webinars were a starting point to get people talking, get people thinking, but we're really aware that the local offers and the local provision and relationships are going to vary hugely across the region. So in terms of next steps, I think it's very much in our thinking that this is then for local areas to go away and think about in terms of where they're currently at and where they would want to move towards. And of course, Lila and Andrea and I are on hand if there's anything that we can do from an NHSE perspective to support with that. There is this strand of work still within this particular work stream around care leavers, so there will continue to be a regional engagement around care leavers and around monitoring and supporting some of those previous strands to this work stream as well, in terms of things like the tariff and the promise that everyone signed up to. I don't know today if I can say much more than that, Rachel. Lila, I don't know from your conversation with Andrew if there's anything more that you would add to that.
No, I'd agree with you. I think the way Andrea describes this is about the bold and the brave. So we know from the presentations what the issues are, and I think the guide was there as to assist systems to go away and think about how do we make this better for this cohort that ticks all the boxes in terms of health inequalities. And obviously there's the adult mental health framework, and there's a bit in there around care leavers or complex young people. So there will be more coming out, but I think at this point in time that's not decided yet. And I think the last point we haven't quite covered, but I think there is an open offer around the care leaver design in adult mental health framework, and if you do want more support with that, then that offer is available.
Thank you both. I just wanted to finish by thanking everyone for their input today, both in terms of questions in the chat, contributions to the discussion, and particularly to Gavin and Layla for their presentations today. I think this is just the start of a process. It's got everyone talking, which is a good place to be, and I still think we've got a long way to go. So thank you to everyone. I understand the slides will be sent round to all of the attendees today, so you'll have copies of those, and the work that Gavin's done around the guide is also available in terms of those key principles. So thank you again, and hopefully there's been food for thought. It will be impactful in terms of at least starting some conversations about how you might deliver services in your local areas, and we can move on and improve outcomes for this most important group of children and young people. So thank you everyone, and enjoy the rest of your Thursday. Thanks
very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.